You know, I've got this Husky 350 right here, and I was putting it together, and I was saying, you know what? Nobody's really done a video for tips and tricks for the 350. So I wanted to hit the high points real quick. Let's do the top 3, and then we'll do a few others. I'm putting together these 350s for a get-together. I've got 3 of them, actually. I got 2 more chassis there. But anyway, I happen to have this almost put together, and I wanted to show at least a couple of issues. These saws suffer from air leak issues, and there's 2 main reasons why they have air leaks, and one of them is the intake clamp that goes here. Ends up, it's a plastic clamp. So Husqvarna in 2008 or 2009 had a bulletin, a technical service bulletin, and ended up recommending this metal clamp here. These aren't that expensive, $8 or something at your local dealer, but this has got to be done. If you're going to go buy a Husqvarna 350, 346 XP, 353, 345, 340, and even the 359s, the 357 XPs, they actually have these plastic clamps. And if you're going to go buy one, look and make sure it doesn't have the plastic clamp. Look and make sure it's got the metal clamp. The reason is because if you don't have the metal clamp on there, your saw is liable to eat itself at any given time. So you don't want to ruin a perfectly good piston and cylinder just because you have a plastic clamp. So get the metal clamp on there. The problem is that you have got to get the cylinder off in order to put that clamp on. So if somebody's trying to sell you a saw with a plastic clamp, make sure you let them know that the value just went down considerably, because somebody has to take the cylinder head off, which you just follow my videos, you can see how to do it, but somebody has to take the cylinder head off, reseal the whole thing, put it back with this metal clamp, and there is a cost to doing that. So there's a cost to the gaskets, there's a cost to the goop, and whatever else you might find to do while you're in there. So you see any of these saws with a plastic clamp, it means it's time for a rebuild. Okay, second tip. These base plates, bearing cups, whatever you want to call them. Bearing cap, bearing cup, right here. It's just a piece of metal. They're cast. And these happen to be machined because I modify them, but we'll get to that in a minute. A hot issue with these is that the bolts that hold them to the base of the chassis, which is under here, 1, 2, 3, 4, those tend to come loose, especially the ones with heavier thread. Now these happen to be M6 by 1 fine thread, but if you happen to have the ones that are heavier thread, then they can tend to come loose, in which case this whole assembly comes loose and you end up in the air leak right by the side. So that's the second air leak issue with this saw, and a main cause for failure. You can actually lose whole top ends because of it. So if you get a saw like this, your best bet is to, not just for the air intake issue, but for the base plate issue, for this bearing cap issue, to just remove it and reseal the whole thing. Again, you can watch my videos and I'll show you how to do that. So very important to do that. I don't know if you can see in there, but you can see sealant gooping out. It's oozing out the sides. So you want a good amount of sealant on there, and then cinch it on down with some blue Loctite, and that way the bearing cap is then resealed properly. I do go over that a little more extensively in my other videos. So that's the second tip. Third tip. These saws have issues with mufflers falling off. Simple thing to do, get a muffler bracket. These are actually from a 346 XP. On the 350s, usually you have to actually cut this one leg off so you can then use it, but these do help support the muffler. And I also use red Loctite on the muffler bolts, but which are, here's an example of a muffler bolt. They're real long. I mean, the whole muffler tends to just wiggle these right out, and you end up with mufflers falling off, and then you end up with cases that have a burn mark in them. Make sure you get a muffler support. They do help. Make sure you put red Loctite on these muffler bolts. That way you don't have a problem like that. If you end up with a burn mark here, sometimes it goes all the way through into the oil tank, and then you have to throw the whole chassis away. So those are the top 3 tips that I have on the Husqvarna 350 and similar chainsaws. As I'm putting the cylinder head down, I have another kind of pet peeve of mine, and that's the issue with cylinder head bolts. And if you have any modification to this saw, number one thing that I do is I take these bearing caps and I mill them down a little bit. I take a little bit of material off, and you can see how shiny that is. So these are milled on the milling machine, and this happens to be minus 0.027. This one was minus 14 thousandths. So we're not talking about much, but when you mill them, you aren't taking material off, and then the problem is that these cylinder head bolts don't necessarily go down far enough. They actually bottom out in the bearing cap, in which case, if they bottom out in the bearing cap, then they're not actually grabbing the flange on the cylinder head. Easiest way to show it, here's a cylinder head and here's a flange. And if this flange is not thick enough, then the bolt will bottom out before it actually grabs the flange, and then the whole cylinder head can move. If the cylinder head moves, now you have an air leak, and then the saw eats itself all over again. So be especially careful with cylinder head bolts. If you need to shorten them, shorten them. Make sure, even measure, put them in, cinch them on down, and you can take a vernier like this, and you can actually measure how much leeway you have, and then measure the flange and find out if you do have actually leeway or not. You may indeed find that you don't, which means, or the space isn't tight enough, which means you actually have to grind on the bolt or get shorter bolts. So that's really a 4th tip. So let me give you a bonus tip. Ready for this? Here's the bonus. So in this gasket, you can see there's a notch here. That notch is for the impulse line. The only problem is when you cinch this down against the bearing cup, you don't see a notch there on the bearing cup. So how is the impulse going to get up and through into that hole? So you actually either have to remove material on the cylinder, or, probably even better, remove material on the bearing cup. So you can see you really need to remove at least a little bit of metal there in order to get a good impulse up and into the cylinder. So, or in order to get a good impulse up and into the carburetor. So consider removing metal on your bearing cap in order to get a good impulse. Porting, modifications. The simplest thing that I do to do port work, even if you're not going to do port work, is to remove material from the bearing cap on these saws in order to optimize squish. Again, you can check out my other videos to see exactly how you can check your squish, and there's plenty of other videos on YouTube to describe that. But you check your squish, you find out what you actually have, usually somewhere in the 40 thousandths range. And if you still want to run a gasket, make sure you're checking the squish with the gasket in there. And then all you have to do is calculate what squish you want. If you want a 20 thousandths squish, you have a 40 thousandths squish currently. Okay, so you have to take 40 minus 20 is 20. So you have to remove roughly 20 thousandths from your bearing cap. And I'll bet you can even do that in the 4-jaw chuck. So if you don't have a Bridgeport milling machine, throw it in the 4-jaw. You could probably do that without too much trouble. So that's the simplest thing to actually increase compression. Either that or a base gasket delete. The problem with base gasket deletes is they're a little bit on the inexact. The results are a little mixed with that. So I think it's just easier to machine this and still run a gasket. And that way, if you change out the cylinder head to something that isn't modified, then you're still pretty tight on the squish. You don't have to have a modified cylinder head. if you are going to modify a cylinder head, you can see here, and I'm not the best porter, so please keep that in mind. You can see here what I've done to this, and let's put this up against a stock cylinder head. So we've got a base gasket here, and on this base gasket you can see how much material you could potentially remove to open this all up. You use the base gasket as a guide. It's not absolute, it's a guide. What I like to do is I like to grab a little bit more air for the forward firing transfer ports there. So I grind this back from here to here. I grind this back from here to here. So I take this surface and grind it back, and then I take this surface and grind it back to here. And you just lean it back. You don't have to grind the whole thing away. You just lean it back, and that way there's nice flow in and out. You also have to, if you're going to be doing that, grind some away from the bearing cup as well. So again, same idea. Use your gasket as your guide, and it'll show you how much material you need to remove. So you're going to remove a little from the front, you're going to remove a little bit from the back here, actually quite a bit. Again, lean it back. I take all these hard edges out the center too. Anything that's a hard edge, I get rid of it. That way you have nice flow. And you can see the result here. So that's the result of that. You can see what I just did. So it doesn't really show you how to do the grinding, but you can see the results and get an idea of what you can do. Now, you don't always have to hog everything out. Just basically optimizing the squish gets you a pretty good increase in compression, which also means pretty good increase in power. Nothing wrong with that. So this is my top few tips on the Husqvarna 350s. Putting things back together. A couple of assembly tips. So as you're putting this thing back together, a couple things you don't want to forget. Number one, the ground strap. It's amazing how many times you put bearing caps down and you forget the ground strap. Ugh. You gotta remove the bolt, put that in, and pray to God this is still sealed. Not a good thing to forget the ground strap. The next thing is the circlips. So don't forget those. If you do, or say, geez, I think I forgot a circlip, or you find one hanging around, you're going to be going back in. You got to take the whole thing apart just to make sure those darn things are there. Because if they're not, if something goes wrong with them, again, the whole thing's just going to eat itself. Bad, bad, bad. Make sure the piston is faced in the correct direction. I had a video a little while back about a catastrophic failure that I saw because somebody actually put the piston the wrong way. Don't do that. Make sure the piston is faced in the correct direction. Make sure the wrist pin is in there with the bearing. If this is flapping all around, it's because you forgot the bearing in there. There's a needle bearing that goes in. I'm doing now blue Loctite on these base screws and red Loctite on these cylinder head bolts. You need to hold this thing down tight so it does not move. So I make sure to put red Loctite on there. And I also use Loctite 515 or 518 on the gasket just to make sure the whole silly thing is sealed. Another mistake that I've made a number of times is putting the cylinder head down without the clamp and the boot on it. You need to have the clamp and the boot already installed on the cylinder before you put the cylinder down. Otherwise, you're going to be taking it apart again because there's really no way to put the boot on with this sitting down there. Last reassembly tip, make sure you use a torque wrench when you're putting this on. A torque wrench and blue Loctite when you're putting the flywheel nut down. There are probably plenty of people that don't, but I've had too many issues with flywheel keys shearing to not be able to recommend that. So make sure when you put the flywheel down, you do it with a torque wrench to the proper spec and blue Loctite on the threads. So thank you for watching this nice condensed version of a masterclass on a Husky 350. I hope you enjoyed it. The 350s I'm putting together here are going to be on display for the Connecticut Get-Together coming up in May, and I'm really excited about that, to show these off and see if there's any differences in all these different cylinder heads that we're putting on. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.